What started as a simple question about what are good and bad examples when it comes to playability in video games has led to a very interesting topic for today, as we're going to jump around to various games and see if we can actually put our finger on what does playability mean in game design. On the previous video about playability, one of the fans left a comment wanting to know good and bad examples when it came to playability. And while at first glance has seemed like a very simple question, it's actually a very tough one to answer. And that has to do with kind of everybody's understanding about the concept of playability. Now, in that video, I mentioned that playability is a very important part that many developers, especially in the indie and first-time areas, tend to mess up on. And the reason is very simple, that most people don't think about games along these lines. And we're going to be showing off a lot of game footage in this video, so we'll be doing the Patreon supporter and sponsor shout out a bit earlier. But before we get there, it's important for everyone to be on the same page when we talk about playability and trying to define it. Now, playability is not the same as accessibility. Accessibility is when you have elements that are designed to allow someone to play your game if they have outside issues that are stopping them. So, colorblind, deafness, arthritis, any kind of physical or mental disorder that would prevent someone from playing your game, that's what accessibility options are for. Playability refers to ways to make a game easier to be experienced from within it, or in other words, allowing people to experience the core gameplay loop of your title. Now, even with that said though, that's still not a very good definition. And this is one of the hardest parts, that every one of you watching this video right now has played games with good playability elements in them. You just probably didn't really think about it like that. And it's very similar to when we talk about UI and control scheme designs. That when they work, you don't think about them at all. But when they bother you or they frustrate you, you are going to raise hell about it. But when I think about trying to define what playability means, I'm going to come up, I came up with this basic definition. And that is, good playability will either remove or mitigate any issues or problems that prevent someone from playing or experiencing the core gameplay loop of a title. And I know even with that, it's still kind of hard to figure things out. But we're going to be switching to multiple game footages now. And before we do that, here's my question for everyone. Can you think of video games that you've played that had a feature or something in it that just made it easier to play this game compared to other examples of that genre? And can you think, on the other hand, of games that, while they belong to a genre that you liked or that you played, they just didn't hook you or you didn't enjoy playing it compared to other examples? But with that said, let's get to some game footage after this quick shout out to our Patreon supporters and sponsors. And now for a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters and current Game Wisdom sponsors. If you would like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. The problem with trying to define what are good and bad examples of playability is that it's not so much an on or off kind of thing. Some games will have good elements of playability along with bad, while other games may do things in a way that could be a bad design game, but may still have some great playability elements to it. And like I said at the end of the last part, this is something that everybody has seen, but may not have realized when these actions come into play. And with that said, our first example in the win column here is Grim Dawn, one of my favorite ARPGs. And like ARPGs before it, it has always ran into that issue of loot overload. When the game just stops because you're just too busy fiddling around with what gear you picked up, trying to figure out Is this good? Is this bad? And again, the point about playability is that it allows the player to focus more on the core gameplay loop and not distracting them from it. So what Grim Dawn, or what Crane Entertainment did with the last expansion that I really loved, was the idea of introducing in basically a loot scale or a loot hider. How it works is that you can turn on, or I'm sorry, a loot filter is the correct terminology there. But how it worked is at any time I can turn on the loot filter and I can tell the game exactly what kind of gear I want to see on screen. Now, gear will drop regardless, but it won't clutter up the screen. I won't need to look at stuff that I know won't matter for my character. So let's say that I want to build a two-handed fire damage warrior. Well, what I would do then is once I've settled on my build, I'm going to go to the loot filter. I'm going to say I want to turn off everything that doesn't relate to being a two-hand weapon, that does fire damage, and that is heavy armor. And then going forward, that is the only gear that I will see on screen. And the reason why this works is that it allows me to focus once again on the ARPG combat. And I know that when I see loot that drops, it's going to be great for me. It's going to be something that I need. And again, this sounds very simple. But ultimately, that's what a lot of playability, or good playability, is. Simple little things that just make your game easier to play and removes any distractions or annoying or nagging elements that get in the way of playing it. And with that said, I'm going to switch to some footage of a game that has one of my more frequent pet peeves when it comes to video games. We turn to Dishonored, and while this is not the only game that has this issue, it's one that I played most recently that did. When it comes to UI design, and kind of breaking the player's own perception of the game. Now, with Dishonored here, you can see on screen my left and right hands, with each hand representing a different ability. In my right hand, or on the right hand side of the screen, you see the knife. On the left hand side, that is your power, or your special ability that you can have on. Sometimes you can have a crossbow in that hand. So, logic would dictate then that the left mouse button would be for your left hand, the right mouse button would be for your right. That's not how it works. What they did was associate that your left mouse button is always for your primary hand, which in this case, I think his name is Ginorno. I'm completely butchering his name, I'm afraid, but he's apparently right-handed. So left is right, right is left. And I know what some of you are thinking right now. What's the big deal? It should just be an easy tick or an easy thing to switch off. But this is an example of bad playability. Remember what I said. Good playability elements remove or mitigate any kind of confusion or things that make your game harder to play. And we've played many first and third person shooters that go with the convention that left goes to your left, right goes to your right action. And another important thing is that this also involves secondary associations to commands. What that means is having an affordance in your UI that the player can relate to in terms of an on-screen action. So, for instance, in the Assassin's Creed franchise, they use the paper doll UI, where the A button corresponds to all feet actions because A is the bottommost button on the gamepad. And then X and B are for your hands, Y is for your head or your eyes. And when you have these secondary affordances, they make it a lot easier for the player to pick up how things work. For instance, if you were to play a Dark Souls or a Souls-like, where the right button on the gamepad corresponds to your left hand and the left button corresponds to your right, that's going to become very frustrating and confusing for somebody to play. And Again, these are little things that most people don't really think about, but it can still rub them the wrong way. So let's switch to some other footage and see what else we can try and narrow down when it comes to playability. For our next example, we have another issue of poor playability, and this is with Surviving Mars, a city builder slash min-max simulator that's all about building a colony on, well, the planet of Mars. And the game has all the lovely elements of moving resources, managing supplies, and resource chaining that logistics fans have come to know and love. But the problem that it has with playability has to do with the UI itself. And the game makes two very, I wouldn't say big, but annoying sins when it comes to UI design. The first has to do with the building UI. That is what you see along the bottom of the screen, below that flashing hexagon. What the game tells you, and there it is in full right there, but the game constantly pops up and chirps about wanting to use the hotkey B to pull up the menu, because it would be quicker, that they say, than moving the mouse pointer down and selecting the build UI, which is the far left on that first or that bottom row. But here's the problem. The UI for building the various buildings pops up already at the bottom of the screen, and when it shows up, it's very close to where the button prompt is. So it actually is slower for hitting B if your mouse cursor is, let's say, near the top of the screen, or you're moving around trying to do stuff, than it is to press that hotkey. And they should have done, if they wanted the menu to be more dynamic or to have a greater ease of use, if I press B, it should pull up information, pull up what buildings I can choose from wherever my mouse cursor is on screen. Or do something similar to Anno, which has kind of a quick build UI that you can set stuff up and then change what items you want to show up there as you play the game. So it will usually start out with roads, the basic building, and food production. So by pressing the button at anywhere on the screen, I can start clicking on the UI and building homes for my people. And I don't know that functionality. I doubt it's in Surviving Mars, but it's such a weird exclusion for this kind of design. Now, the other issue the game has is one that I'm sure if you've paid attention to previous talks about UI design, you know what it is. And that is the somewhat indecipherable number of symbols and numbers at the top of the screen. As you can see at the top there are a lot of little things. Some are red, some are green, and for a new player, it's very hard to understand what all that means. Now, you can put your mouse cursor over them for tooltips, but the tutorial gives you no idea what any of that stuff is. What does research do? What about those various numbers on the far right-hand side, the one that just tick down? And this is very important when it comes to UI design and symbology. If you're going to use symbols and numbers, you have to explain to the player what they mean unless they are universal. So if they put a red cross in your game, then we can assume that means health, or a fire hydrant, or fire helmet for fire services. A college, those like little placard hats for education. Universal symbology is a very important way of minimizing or streamlining complexity. But if you're using all original symbols, then you have to explain to the player what that means. Now, with that said, though, we could spend another 20-30 minutes easily just going through examples of playability. Again, that's one of the challenges of talking about this. But I think for our final example for this video, we're going to turn to a positive, and how a developer did something different, but it still improved the playability of their game. For our final example on playability, we're returning to Odallus the Dark Hall, and what it did so well by going out of the box, or thinking outside the box with its UI design. Now, if you're a fan of retro or non-retro games, then you know that the conventional UI design is using an info pane along the top or bottom of the screen horizontally. What Odalis, or by proxy Joymasters, did was use this double vertical pane along the left and right hand side. And I want to ask everybody watching this right now, can you think of any other games in the retro space that made use of this UI? Or this kind of UI convention? Because I couldn't think of any. Now, the reason why this is being brought up is twofold. One is that the UI itself is a great example of making a very streamlined and easy to understand UI for players. With the information framed along the left and right hand side of the screen, it allows the player to completely see the main screen. Again, that's the middle window, and be able to keep their attention on it. One of the issues with kind of the horizontal top or bottom UI is that it can be a very awkward frame, and sometimes it can hide enemies or things from attacking you off screen from the top or bottom. By keeping the screen firmly centered like this, it allows the player again to process what everything is going on in the middle and not having to really take their eyes off to view information on the left and right. And most importantly, the information that's on the screen allows them to keep it all on one screen. You don't need 2 or 3 different UI or window panes to find information that the player needs. The other reason why I'm bringing this up as an example of good playability is that this is a case of developer doing something different, seeing that there may be thinking there could have been or there is an issue with previous conventions, and deciding to do their own thing with it. And that's very important from a playability standpoint. As we've talked about in previous videos, you want to examine other developers and other games of the genre that you're working in. And you're going to do that because you want to see what works and what doesn't. And sometimes, if you see something that's very popular, but there are some issues or ways you can improve that, if you can do that, then that's going to make your game better for it. Now, with that said though, as we've talked about many times before, that doesn't mean you should be unique for unique's sake, especially when it comes to UI. One of the biggest points about when games fail playability is when a developer goes so far outside the box that it's completely unrecognizable to somebody, and there's no explaining it or no in-game way for the player to understand it. And good playability, again, is about keeping the player focused on your core gameplay loop. And in this case with Odalis, there is nothing that is distracting us from this 2D action adventure. And that's why it's such a great UI. But to begin to wrap things up, as I just said, when it comes to defining playability in game design, it is about ways to minimize or remove elements that would distract the player from experiencing your core gameplay. And again, this is not the same as accessibility. That's another topic in of itself. Games that have high playability are usually very easy to grasp, and the game does a great job explaining things to the player or keeping them focused on the task at hand. Whenever you have to stop what you're doing and either look something up or switch between multiple windows or screens of information, that is usually the sign that there are some playability issues. And like we've said at the start, playability is not a topic that we can just wrap up in a 15 to 20 minute long video. There are many different aspects and conventions when it comes to UI design that fit in this space. But for developers watching this, the important notes to take from this video are that you always want to pay attention to what is the main focus of your game, and are there any parts of it, either intentional or not, that distract or keep the player from experiencing it. Because if there are, then you want to do everything that you can to get rid of them or downplay them. Again, some genres are going to be harder than others. You're never going to completely remove, the sheer amount of loot and information that a player is going to see in an RPG. But there are ways to make that information more presentable and easier to understand. And for those of you watching this, besides examples that we've talked about and discussing more on playability, can you think of other great examples of games that use whether subtle or very overt methods to make their game more playable? Let me know in the comments below, but thank you so much for watching this video. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, take care. If you're looking for a book on design, my first title, 20 Essential Games to Study, is out now. It is available where most books are sold, and it comes in paper, hardcover, or digital copies. This is the perfect book for anyone interested in learning about game design, whether you are a student, enthusiast, or just a fan. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.